The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Matthew Darius. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator here at ASBO, and I'll be moderating today's call. The topic of today's webinar is planning and the financing of capital facilities. We have Mark Kozlowski and Mike Shizda from Financial Advisors and Marketing out of Syracuse. If you have any questions during the call, please feel free to hit the raise hand button on your GoToWebinar control panel, and either myself or Mark or Michael will answer your question. With that out of the way, Mark, it's all yours.
All right, Matthew, thank you very much, and thank you for joining us today, everyone. This is going to be an overview of capital project financing and planning for New York State School District. And these come from our years of experience in working with schools, along with some recent changes that have taken place. So to go on to page 2, we find that in developing the project timeline and some of the strategies we use, one of the best things that we can try to convey to our school district clients is to try to assemble the team at least 1 year before a public referendum. This gives people ample opportunity to plan for perhaps building up cash reserves, planning for possible debt falling off to roll in new capital project debt in the future, and to give everybody ample opportunity to study the work that's planned for the buildings in your district, and to really concentrate on what will be talked about later called maximum cost allowances. Some of the parties involved that are critical to the planning team include district officials, architect, construction manager, if there is one, and of course financial advisor and bond counsel. Part of the strategizing is determining what are the district's needs versus their wants. I'm sure you've run into situations before where teachers, the public, all want certain personal things in a capital project. But when we talk about needs, which is the focus of developing a 5-year capital plan and the building condition surveys, they have to meet in order so that the state aids the district properly. So it's very important to come to that point where you meet the needs versus the wants. A lot of it has to do with prioritizing the work that needs to be done, scheduled work to be performed, and also having an understanding of the timing of building aid and the retirement of existing debt. Careful consideration is needed to address the calculation of maximum cost allowances, and this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the presentation. Because for us upstate communities and through communities throughout New York State, everybody has a building aid ratio associated with their school district. But a key component of that building aid ratio is understanding what is aidable within a capital project. So the what is aidable portion is what we call the maximum cost allowance. And that's very important to understand, and we'll go through some calculations and how SED takes a look at that. Another important discussion is the setting up of the capital project accounting and record keeping, to have a clear understanding of whose roles and responsibilities are in tracking not only construction expenditures but incidental expenditures. Oftentimes it's the incidental expenditures that kind of get away from everybody and become harder to track at the end of a project than at the beginning of a project. Another key component is establishing contact with SED early and developing a communication with the project manager. You know, we recommend that the school district not rely on a financial advisor or an architect to tell them how a project will be aided. But in discussions with the advisor and the architect, the school district should be meeting with their project manager to say, this is the project that we're contemplating for our district, and does it conform to the building condition survey, and how is this going to be aided by the state? The project managers are more than willing to go through the calculations of maximum cost allowances with the district, and the district should avail themselves of that opportunity. If we go to the next page, this is a discussion of scope development. Through user group meetings, it's important to determine who are the decision makers and who needs to be available for input. Shared decision making is a wonderful concept, but if too many people become involved, the districts can lose themselves in too many voices, too much input. So it's important to parcel out, who is going to be part of the decision-making process and what's important to get your building project through. We need to verify the scope of work versus the bond and seeker resolutions. It's very important from a legal standpoint that the work that is being performed conform to those two resolutions. Because if there's ever any point for the public to challenge a referendum, it's when there's a disconnect, when work is being done that wasn't contemplated in a seeker resolution or wasn't contemplated in the proposition. So you have to be very careful of that and very leery of that. Does the scope of work follow items identified in the building condition survey? This is critical because you might get some pushback from SED or the project manager saying, geez, those additions sound like a great idea for you locally, but we may not be willing to aid that based upon the projections of your student enrollment or your capacity of your building. So it's important to mirror or follow the building condition survey, and if it deviates from that, to have a legitimate argument as to why you might need something that the state might not be willing to aid. Will any of the wish list items require a change to the rated capacity of the building or require the district to update its enrollment projections? So we're entering a period of time in the state where some school districts are thinking of closing some elementary schools. So the question will be asked and we'll have to explore is, how does that change the rated capacity of the other buildings? If a district is aware that they're going to be reviewing their buildings for possible closure, what type of work are they contemplating in that building? And perhaps they should just consider the minimal amount of work at the present time. So it's important to think about all these factors when considering a building project. And then, of course, the districts need to review their debt limit. A debt limit is something that's part of every local government in New York State, and there's certain constitutional limits as to how much a district can borrow. There are mitigating factors which allow for districts to exceed their debt limit, but it's a very challenging aspect if a district runs into that. So just knowing that prior to entering a capital project for possible public discussion is important. Planning for the receipt of building aid. As perhaps most of you are aware, the state has changed their methodology for the amortization of building aid drastically. For projects that are approved after July 1st, 2011, building aid will not start flowing for districts that have approved capital projects until after the receipt of a certificate of substantial completion and the final building project report. So it's going to be quite the challenge to start funding for a capital project prior to the receipt of that aid. So careful consideration is going to have to take place in planning the financial plan for districts going forward. In order to get the aid stream started, or for multi-project authorization, it may be necessary to design smaller projects, roofs, window replacements, that can be completed in a more timely fashion. If you can envision a number of years ago, many districts entered large capital projects, 30, 40, 50 million over multiple buildings. And for many districts, the experience was final cost reports were completed perhaps 5, maybe even 6 years after the public referendum. Well, if that were to happen in today's environment, when you had to start the financing 3 or 4 years prior to the completion of the final building project report, there'd be a number of years in which you'd have debt service and no building aid. So what we are contemplating as part of discussions of capital projects going forward is how projects can be broken up into smaller pieces to drive the building age sooner rather than later. Perhaps the referendums themselves will be on a smaller nature so that districts can get their arms around capital projects a lot better than some of these mega projects that we've seen. Another important component is the timing of building aid and how it may be impacted by the possible need of capitalized interest. So in any building aid calculation, the state calculates their own capitalized interest as part of the building aid formula. The capitalized interest we're talking about is a legal parameter that's allowed in New York State whereby districts can add in to the budget of a capital project an estimated amount of money that represents interest prior to receiving aid on a capital project. So typically that would be an estimation of interest on bond anticipation notes. It could be 1, 2, 3 years, however long a district feels that they would need to have capitalized interest. Now the capitalized interest itself would not be aidable under current building aid regulations. But if it was included in a referendum amount and if it was borrowed for, that is a source of money the district could use to help offset debt service until building aid arrives. So at the very least, it should be a topic of discussion. The last item, has the district reviewed their rolling 5-year MCAs? This has been an important discussion with the State Education Department that has received a lot more detail over the last several months. And by detail, we say that in the past, there was an assumption that the MCAs pertain to the whole capital project or the whole building if it was a single building capital project. Now it's our understanding from SED that the MCAs will be in effect for a period of 5 years, and if a capital project is done within the 5 years, then that reduces the MCAs on not only the construction portion, but the incidental portion. And why is that important? Because if you were to have 2 capital projects for the same building within the 5-year period, both of those would be subject to the same maximum cost allowance. And so it's an important discussion to have if a district is entering or contemplating a new capital project on a building that is still using up MCAs from a previous capital project. Mike, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
Yeah, just the 5-year clock is calculated using the date of commissioner's approval for a project. So if you're contemplating a project within the next year or two, and you've got projects in any of your buildings that were approved, say anywhere 2009, 2010, you're going to be looking at 2014 or 2015 before your maximum cost allowances are restored back to the full value. So you have to look at what your current projects, your recent projects were, look at the commissioner's approval date and say, okay, will we have enough of cost allowance both for construction and incidental to do another project within the 5-year window, or do we have to wait till the 5-year window has gone by while we can get the full allowance back? We do have some districts that have gotten to the point within the 5-year window where they have used up the total incidental allowance, they still have plenty of construction allowance available, but no incidental allowance. So at least one district is looking at a 2-year wait to get to phase 2, simply because they did a lot of site work in phase 1 and ate up the whole allowance on their building. So you really need to watch that 5-year clock and verify with your facilities planning project manager how much cost allowance you really have remaining for the next project.
So to give you a sample of what the state uses to calculate your maximum cost allowance, this was a sheet that we downloaded from SCD's website. And so when you're looking at maximum cost allowance, it's calculated by building. So if you looked at this sheet, you could look at it for any one of your buildings, and there would be segments on those sheets for designation of pre-K through 6, 7-9, 7-12, and special education. And there's calculations for alterations, contract allowance, and incidental allowance, as well as new space, contract allowance, and incidental allowance. So what the state does is they say, okay, if this is an elementary school we're looking at, what are the, and it's a reconstruction project, what are the number of building aid units in that elementary school? Now, typically it's the rated capacity of the school building. It's not the actual enrollment, it's not the projected enrollment, it's the rated capacity. So if there were 100 students that were affected by that capital project, and it had a rated capacity of 100 students, the 100 would be in the number of building aid units in that particular building in the pre-K through 6. And then the construction cost index is the latest cost index that the state publishes every month on their website. So it's a simple calculation of that. And then the total is a representation of the maximum cost that the state will aid at the district's building aid ratio. And so it's important to note there's a construction cost index or maximum cost allowance, and there's an incidental maximum cost allowance. And if you were to have a new building or an addition, there's a separate calculation below. And these are done for each of the buildings. So for a financial advisor, this is a very important component or exercise to go through so that we're aware of what are your pressures in each of your building or potential pressures for aidability. Now this screen might be a little bit tougher to read, but it's an important tool that we use in taking a look at your building. And so what we do is we set up columns that shows by building number the projects that are being contemplated in a total referendum. And so we run through a calculation of the estimated approval date by SCD, when the first aid eligibility date would occur, the first fiscal year that you may receive aid, the type of construction that will occur in each of the buildings. The sample here is a reconstruction project. So we've labeled it 15 years because in New York State, all reconstruction work in a particular building, if the majority of the work is reconstruction, will be aided over 15 years. In this sample, there's a component for capital outlay or capital reserve and other fundraising, which might include Excel aid or budgetary appropriation. And so we come up with an estimated cost allowance or aidability in each of the buildings. So if you go down to line 18, you can see that overall, this building project would be aided at 93%, but certain buildings would receive something a little less than that. And so this is how we formulate how much aid would be received by each building, and then we create another sheet that shows us the aid stream and when we feel the aid might start coming into the district. again, in New York State, financing of a capital project is kind of counterintuitive. We're working backwards. We're first trying to find out when the aid is going to be received by the district, and then starting to build our financial model around it to see if this is going to be able to work for the district. So the next slide, on page 8, pulls everything together. And this is what you might consider a typical debt service schedule or amortization plan, which shows some basic assumptions when the referendum would pass, when SED projects would be submitted and approved, and when construction might start. And because of the new building aid rules, it's important to know when construction would start because we need to estimate when it might end and when building aid might start flowing to the district. So in this model, we show the balance outstanding, principal payments, estimated interest. Column 5 is your total debt service, or what you would be appropriating in your budget each year. And under this scenario, we're conservative, or trying to be conservative, and showing building aid not being received until the 16-17 fiscal year. And so the estimated local share is what's not supported by building aid, but there are other revenue offsets. So you'll notice in column 8, under this scenario, we give an example of how capitalized interest can be used. So under this example, the capitalized interest has helped to offset that local share of debt service in the first and second year. And remember, capitalized interest really is only used to offset interest expense. It can't be used to offset principal. So the net effect is in column 9. Now, a perfect schedule might show, building aid coming a year earlier with a minimal amount of debt service in the first year against what would typically be bond anticipation notes. We are going to see, as a trend, more districts using bond anticipation notes throughout their capital project until the district knows when building aid is going to be received, and then borrowing long term. It's just a function of making sure that the district doesn't bond before they know when that last aid payment is being paid. Oops. Go back. All right, let's talk about SCD review. SCD reviews architectural and engineering. They provide the approval of plans and specs by the commissioner. Typically, they're an electronic submittal. There's follow-up between the architect and the district. And it's also important to determine, and this is a district determination, who's going to be the responsibility of change order follow-through. Oftentimes, we find with a capital project, change orders get lost in the process, meaning that either the architect is waiting towards the end of the project to file all the change orders, or the change orders have supposedly gone in and nobody's followed up with any questions from SED, and it's very hard to chase change orders at the end of a project. So what we encourage districts to do is determine, okay, who's the responsibility of filing the change orders, making sure they're processed and recorded at the district, eventually on the final building project report. And that can be any number of parties or individuals, but it's important to have that trail. At the State Education Department, two main programs. There's facilities planning and state aided programs. Facilities planning is responsible for determining the rated capacity, maximum cost allowances, issuing the building permits, reviewing plans and specs. State aided programs are responsible for all your state aid filings that have to be done by the district. which include 139, final building project reports, CSEs.
Just a quick note on the 139s. Those of you that have lived through projects know that that is the form that's submitted to state aid after bids are taken, contracts have been awarded, the schedule of values are received from contractors. The SA 139s are supposed to reflect real numbers, real costs, and not just the reiteration of the architect's initial estimates. So it's critical that the district provide as good a data as it can on the 139s, because that is going to be used to set up the initial amortization for building aid. And even though building aid may not begin at the 18-month timeline, the submission of the 139 should take place, as it always has, once those contracts are awarded, once the schedule of values are there. Get the 139 submitted. We've been told by the folks at state aid they're going to set up the prospective project amortization using the 18-month timeline, under the assumption that all projects will be completed within 18 months. So if you think, well, you know, we're not going to get aid for another couple of years, I don't need to do the 139. The answer is no. You need to do the 139 timely, get it there, let state aid set up the amortization, and if you can get that project done and the final report done on time or within that 18-month or even 2-year window, everything will be set up for your aid to be paid. So the 139 doesn't get delayed just because the aid is delayed now. It needs to be done, and it needs to be done with your best accurate numbers, because if you just, again, reiterate architect's estimates and the aid is set up incorrectly, that's not a good thing to have. You want accurate estimates through this whole process.
All right, if we go to the next page, we'll begin a discussion of planning for the financing. An important legal procedure that should be taken care of right after referendum is the passage of the bond resolution and notice of estoppel. Typically it's prepared by bond counsel and perhaps the local counsel at the district, or sometimes even district officials. Now, a proposition, if you recall, is really, or referendum rather, is really asking the voters to spend money on a capital project. The second component is the bond resolution. The bond resolution authorizes a district to borrow so that it has monies to spend on a capital project. So it's two distinct legal procedures that have to be followed to make sure that the school district is prepared for the financing. One of our key component tools that we use in determining how much to finance and when is not only the timing of building aid, but it's development of the project cash flow. We use that cash flow to make sure that we're borrowing enough money for the district and to make sure that we're not going to run afoul of any IRS compliance issues that refer to the rebate expenditure requirements. Now, typically a project cash flow is developed by the architect or construction manager, and it's important to impress upon them that this is something that's going to be very necessary for capital projects going forward. Developing financing plan and budget for debt service. We take a look at the analysis of short-term versus long-term financing and when we think we might be able to first look at financing long-term, the timing of debt with the receipt of state aid, the development of financial statistical data. That means all the financial data that's necessary for what we call an official statement or the prospectus that investors will look at for buying your notes and bonds. We need to plan for capitalized interest if that is part of a capital project. We need to prepare ourselves for market entry. And by that, we need to take a look at what is the rating review process. what does a rating review entail? How does that affect any borrowings that come up and any future borrowings? We take a look at the legal framework. What is the maximum period that the district will be able to borrow for its capital project? Is it a full 30 years, or is it perhaps a shorter term based upon the type of building that's being worked on? I mentioned the rating agent review and sale of debt. That's a timing issue. We have to build in enough time so that the rating agencies can take a look at the district, to conduct a conference call, to go to what we call rating committee. Filing of the debt statement with the state comptroller. That's an important legal requirement for any municipality that issues debt in New York State. Recalculating building aid estimates, which occur as changes are made to the maximum cost allowance, building aid ratio, and amortized rate. It would be great if everything was static at the time you voted on your referendum. But as we've found out over the years, the MCAs change because the MCAs that you're using at the time of referendum is based upon the construction cost index, which might be 9 months old. And the MCAs aren't set until the district bids on its and awards its general construction contract. So that might not be available or current for perhaps 12 to 18 months. But it's important to recognize that and adjust the maximum cost allowance over time as you get fresher data. As districts know, your building aid ratio changes. It would be great if your building aid ratio was always the same as the date you voted, but that's not the case. It changes from year to year. Typically not drastically, but it does change. And the amortized rate will change depending upon if the district issues obligations on their own or through the dormitory authority of New York State. And then there's the closing and delivery of proceeds, so you can start paying contractors. Timing of financing and building aid, we'll just go over an overview of some things to consider. We feel more detailed strategic planning must be developed between the architect, construction manager, and the financial advisor. You know, I think it's important to let the construction manager and architect know how important it is that we understand the timeline and we have a good sense of when construction will start, when the contract might be finished, because we're worried about when building aid is going to start coming into the district and helping to offset debt service. Project timelines need to show anticipated SED review and approval, a construction timeline, and anticipated project closeout by building. Building aid by building will commence, as we had mentioned previously, the later of 18 months after Commissioner's approval or the receipt of final building project reports and the certificate of substantial completion by SED. We think if historical trends are any indication that many districts are going to receive building aid you know, longer than that 18-month period. You know, we can say based on our assistance in helping districts complete final cost reports, it's typically 4 or 5 years on average after you know, public referendum that these reports go into SED. So whether, you know, we'll all try to do a better job of getting them in faster, that remains to be seen, because it's typically punch list items that you're trying to chase down at the end of a project that are near impossible to get done in a timely manner. You know, over time those things might change and we might be able to condense that window, but we just don't see districts right now being able to get those reports in earlier than 18 months. Financing will need to be balanced between meeting cash flow needs and the timing of building aid, and in order to avoid debt service with no aid. That's our overall goal. Some important factors to consider when looking at a capital project is an understanding of the regulatory oversight and enforcement of debt that is out there in the debt markets. The Dodd-Frank Act required all municipal advisors now to be registered with the SEC and MSRB. That's going to be very important to know going into the future to make sure your advisor has those underway. The State Education Department understanding the new rules and regulations with regards to building aid. Office of the New York State Comptroller reviews all debt limit calculations and debt statement calculations, and for those districts that have been involved in refunding, the State Comptroller approval of refundings are required. The SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, how are they involved? Well, they oversee all debt that's issued in the United States of America, and they key in on the accuracy of the official statement and that the districts are willing to continually disclose the current financial situation of the district on an annual basis. How is the Internal Revenue Service involved? Internal Revenue Service is concerned, because you're issuing tax-exempt debt, that you're adhering to arbitrage rebate compliance, which in essence means that the IRS doesn't want you borrowing money too soon in advance of when you expect to spend it. There are nuances to the regulations that could go in much more detail, but suffice it to say that's the whole goal of arbitrage rebate compliance, to make sure you're just not borrowing money to make money in advance of when you actually need it. And also post-issuance compliance, which means once you issue your obligations or your debt, are you tracking that to make sure that you're not running afoul of the arbitrage rebate compliance regulations? And of course, perhaps the biggest oversight would be your Board of Education. Some of the New York State Constitution restrictions. New York State, the Constitution limits the amount of outstanding debt for all units of government. There are certain exceptions or exclusions districts can make, but knowing that there is limits out there is important. For central schools, the calculation is to use the most recent equalized value of your property, taxable property that is, with a 10% limit. Now the debt limit for small city schools is a little more restrictive. It's their average 5-year property wealth with a calculation of 5%. So small city schools, for all intents and purposes, are penalized for being a small city school. They just do not have the capacity that central schools have. The debt limit is calculated at the date of a given borrowing, not the voter authorization or subsequent borrowing. It's at the date of borrowing. And the debt statement must be filed with the State Comptroller when selling bonds. And there's actually a window prior to the sale of the bonds that the debt statement has to be filed. If it's too many days prior to that window or too many days after, the sale date has to be adjusted. Exclusions from the debt limit may be granted for central schools by requesting a building aid estimate from SED. And basically that calculation takes into account the aidability of the debt that you're going to be selling and reducing that aid from the calculation of what's going to be applied against the debt limit. City schools are not granted this type of exclusion, but they may exceed the debt limit if the voters approve the project by a 60% supermajority of the voters. The next page, some of the local finance law restrictions. The maximum repayment period from the date of the first borrowing is 30 years for most school districts in New York State. So that 30 years would start regardless of whether you issued notes or bonds first. That's whenever the first borrowing occurs. So we see a challenge for districts that might need to build a new building because they're going to be restricted by that 30-year legal repayment, and yet their aid might not start 1, 2, or even possibly 3 years after the district needs to start the borrowing. So we're not sure how districts will get over that hurdle yet, but we'll have to meet that challenge when we come to it. A principal repayment must begin within 24 months after the date of the first series borrowing against a given authorization. So you have up until 2 years from the date of borrowing on bond anticipation notes to make your first principal payment. It kind of allows you a slight window to minimize your debt service that first year by paying interest only. Districts typically would use substantially level debt service where there's no balloon payments. You can consider it very similar to a mortgage or car payments, except for the fact that the principal payments would have to be in at least $5,000 blocks or denominations. And that's to make sure that it's sellable to investors and the public. But once a principal payment is made, no more than 12 months may elapse before the next principal payment. And all principal must be paid by the end of the period of probable usefulness. Bond anticipation notes may be used and renewed up to 5 years. The transition of serial bonds is required under local finance law by the end of the 5th year if a longer repayment period is used. Issuance of debt, timing and sizing. A critical component in the timing and sizing is the project timeline. When are the SED submission and approval, project bid, etc. A key component is cash flow from the architect, construction manager. What are your soft costs and pre-construction costs? Before your project is approved by SED, it's important to know, what are those soft costs? Where does the district come up with the money to pay those costs before the project is approved? Is it going to be a short-term note to cover those costs? Are there capital reserve monies that can be used to pay those costs to delay the borrowing? Can the general fund loan money to the capital fund to pay those soft costs or some of them, and again delay the borrowing? Interfund transfer loan from capital fund or to capital fund rather, or capital reserves are mentioned. Arbitrage sizing of issues. So the arbitrage sizing of issues was discussed previously. It's important to know, when the cash flow is going to be spent to determine how much of a borrowing we can undertake. Let's have a discussion of the type of debt to be issued. This might be a foregone conclusion going forward, but the determination of whether you're issuing bonds or notes is determined by a couple factors. And we listed them on this page. Bond anticipation notes are 1-year interest rate, which are much lower than bonds. They provide for the least debt service prior to the arrival of building aid. They're usually 1 year or less and may be renewed for up to 5 years. So perhaps of most concern to districts is the fact that it's the least amount of debt service when you're beginning your borrowing, which is going to be important because of the concern with the timing of building aid. With serial bonds, they're based on long-term interest rates, which are higher than 1-year notes. Once issued, the debt service is fixed unless there's a call provision or an option of prior redemption. And there are two major options for issuing bonds in New York State for schools. You may issue them on your own, or you may issue them through DASNY. When does it make sense for either one? Issuing on your own makes sense generally when a district receives little building aid, or the assumed amortization rate is higher than the current market interest rate, so that there might be an opportunity where the state is aiding you at a higher amortized rate than where the current market rates are if you were to issue on your own. Now, issuing through DASNY generally makes sense when a district is highly aided and the assumed interest rate is lower excuse me, than where current market rates are. Capital project accounting and aid. We feel strongly that the completion of a final building project report starts on the first day of a successful voter referendum, such that the district really should be setting up their books on day one to account for any expenditures that will appear on the final building project report 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, so that at the end of a project, when you make your last payment, you record your last expense on the report, and you can get that into SED as soon as possible to start receiving building aid. So that's going to be an important mantra that we're going to be relaying to all our school districts in the future. The accounting should be updated at least monthly. And when we say updated, updated amongst the parties involved in the capital project. Is everybody in agreement to where the building project costs are, from the school district to the construction manager to the architect to the financial advisor? Are we all in agreement that the costs in building A are agreeable on construction and incidental, and on building B and on building C and in totality? We want to know where we are with change orders. You know, is the change order submitted going to be aidable? Where is that change order going to rely or be calculated in which building? So that's an important, at least monthly discussion that districts should have. Contractor's schedule of values should be reviewed for aidability with the MCAs and the cash flow. When we're building our models pre-referendum, remember, these are all based on estimates, based upon something that might not be put out to bid and awarded for a year, 18 months. So when the contractor's schedule of values come in after award, it's important to take another look at the MCAs to make sure where we are in those calculations. Change order tracking, we mentioned that previously, and the timeline for submission of the final building project report. The next two pages, which will wrap up our discussion today, just review the some of the most important documents that flow between facilities planning and state aid with the district. Just briefly, some of those are the letter of intent, which is the first document that the school will send to SCD requesting a project number and a project manager assigned to the district. The application and examination and approval of final plans and specs accompany the architectural drawings, and they're a first look at the project budget by building. So this document we call an FPF will have two sides. It'll have the financing side on the front, and it'll have the budget per building on the back. And these are the first documents that we start building our financial models around. The SA4 is the notification of building project. There might be an application for apportionment of building aid. The SA139, as Mike had mentioned, should be filed after the signing of the construction contracts, and this is where we do our double check of budget and aidability. The SA130, very important document. Once those previous documents are filed, the state will generate an SA130, or cost allowance and bond percentage for building aid purposes, that is sent back to the district that shows the maximum cost allowances for each of the buildings and whether the expenses or projected expenses are covered by that maximum cost allowances to maximize your building aid. Change orders must be approved by Facilities Planning and the Board of Education. For a final building project report, it's important because we have to file in there the date that it was approved by SED and the change order amounts. So that's very important to have that tracked. The certificate of substantial completion starts the clock for final. Well, did start the clock for final cost report deadline. Now it becomes its own deadline for generating building aid. For those districts that need to look at an exclusion of their aid for their debt limit, two important forms are the SA-23 and SA-24. The SA-23 is generated by the district to SED, requesting that building aid be excluded. The SA-24 comes back to the district showing the building aid estimate, and that number then is applied to reduce the amount of debt that's calculated against your debt limit. Final building project reports used to be that their failure resulted in a forfeiture of all aid. We're working with a number of districts that have gotten notices lately, but they become a critical component now because without filing the building project report, you will get no aid. And then an old form called an SA-135 is for detailing fund anticipation note data for SCD. So that concludes our presentation today. We hope you found it helpful, and I guess at this point we'd be entertaining any questions you have.
Hi, this is Jacqueline from New York State Association of School Business Officials. Matt had to step out, so if you have any questions, just please click the raise your hand button, and we'll entertain any questions you have. Nobody has any questions? Okay, I guess we're all set. Thank you guys for a great presentation, and we'll be emailing everybody a recording of today's webinar, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.